Come on, come on. Awesome. Okay, now can you guys see the screen? Not frozen? Okay, good. Perfect. Before we get started, is there anything that we wanted to discuss about the lab protocols? I sort of posted just sort of a breakdown of what you would need to do. I posted the lab protocol and quiz for the second lab. That's going to be due on the 26th. So as well in 2 weeks, so that there's time there. No questions? Feel free to email your or schedule, like if you know who your TA is, it's gonna be listed on that announcement as well. You can email your TA and get a better idea of like more formality things in terms of the questions by emailing them directly. Today's lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to actually get into sort of like heavy motor control stuff. So we're actually getting into like motor control specifics. And then we're going to finish off with talking about sort of how it's important to accumulate or coordinate sensory processes or use that information when determining how to move our body or how to control our neuromuscular system. Any questions before we get started? So we had a question from Alex. Is there a difference in reaction time between auditory and visual cues is due to different processing times in the brain? Yeah. So a bit of processing, but it's also like the length of the nerves. So there's a bunch of different reasons. Okay. So this is the outline of today's lecture. We're going to be discussing motor control theories and how research has sort of developed ideas on how we control our neuromuscular system. We're going to talk about different types of systems and then the two individual theories that were developed. And then, like I said, we're going to be finishing off with talking about different sensory components to motor control. So let's first start by discussing an introduction to motor control theory. So motor control involves the study of the behavioral and the neuromuscular mechanisms which produce coordinated movement. So it's not just how the nerves interact with the muscles and how we contract different muscles. It's how our body, how we were able to interact with our environment to sort of take the movements that we've learned and modify them for that situation. So when we discussed how sort of motor control studies first started, it sort of developed out of like psychology or sort of behavioral psychology. They wanted to understand in terms of research, what are the external factors that influence our ability to perform motor skills? And so this is where sort of the research started. Let's go with this. Okay. So as a definition of like the study of motor control, these studies are going to be studying the process by which the central nervous system determines the appropriate measures to achieve the goal of a motor skill. So how does the motor planning areas configure a motor plan to manipulate your body in a specific way? And then how does it take that skill and modify it to certain factors in the environment to make sure that we are able to achieve the skill of the goal of the skill, whatever that would be. And so motor control studies wanted to look at specifically what would be the nature of the command that's issued by our brain to our muscles? Is it just action potentials? Like, is it talking about like core muscles? Is it talking about other types of information? What's the content of the instructions that our brain is coming up with? And then the next thing is that one thing that you notice with someone that is becoming better at performing a particular motor skill, like think about like a basketball player that is a really good shooter. So they've highly developed that ability or that motor skill of shooting the basketball. And they're able to sort of achieve that under a wide range of conditions, whether or not they're, off balance, or they have a defender, or if it's a 3 or 2-pointer shot, or if they are, under pressure. Lots of different factors can be interpreted, and then a person that's an expert at a skill is able to sort of coordinate all of that information into the motor skill and then perform that with high efficiency despite the fact of changing external environment. So how can we account for that? And so motor control studies wanted to understand what specifically is some of the factors in relation to that topic. Okay. So in terms of a theory, so this is coming from more like science. So the idea of what is a motor control theory, well, let's first define what a theory is. And a theory is sort of what we develop through studies. So a theory is a way to accurately describe a large class of behaviors. So you can develop a theory to suggest why your research is always finding this sort of study. And what defines sort of the theory into a law is that it allows you to make predictions about future observations. So if you take enough observations to describe, the results that you're finding in all of your studies, if it is accurate, you're able to make predictions in other studies about what you're going to be able to see in the results of that study, because you've developed this sort of theory of, in this case, it's going to be motor control. So when in relation to motor control theory, what we need to specifically sort of analyze or develop an understanding of from a study perspective is that we want to understand or address motor control from a behavioral level. Look at the different factors that sort of influence our ability to control our body, and then use that information to describe and explain how the nervous system produces coordinated movement time and time again. So as you learn something, you're able to do it over and over and over again with high amount of accuracy, and you're able to do that under a wide variety of environments. So that's what the theory is sort of wanting to explain. And so there was two main theories, and we're going to discuss them in today's lecture. But they wanted to sort of answer or be able to answer two specific questions. And those specific aspects or questions were the degrees of freedom problem and coordination. So the next couple of slides, we're going to be talking about these two questions that motor control studies or motor control theories wanted to answer. So the first one is the degrees of freedom problem. Have you guys ever heard of the term degrees of freedom? It means the number of independent elements in a system and the number of ways that each element can act. So one degree of freedom is one plane of movement. 3 degrees of movement means 3 planes of movement. There's more movement available. So if we look at the marionette sort of picture on the slide, if we think of our body, think of all the moving parts that we have individually. So there is a huge number of elements that we would have to control when voluntarily controlling our body to perform a particular skill that we would want to do. And so rather than 1, 2, or 3 degrees of freedom, think about the amount of movement that you would have to control when looking at just a simple example of someone picking up a coffee cup. So that's going to be, range of motion of the shoulder, elbow, wrist. Each of the fingers have different finger joints as well as a thumb. And so we're looking at 18 different joints. So then theories wanted to sort of understand, let's come up with some ways that explain how the body is able to control so many different joints at once. So does it have to process it every single time? So if I'm going to be picking up a cup, do I look at the cup and have to process specifically what muscles to contract? Or is there a program that has been sort of developed that sort of simplifies the control, and then you just have to, add the aspects of the environment to that program. And that was sort of one of the theories that we discussed. It's called motor program theory, and we'll discuss it. So that was the first thing, is that theories have to discuss the discrete, they at least have to describe and sort of discuss how we can solve for the degrees of freedom problem. The next thing is coordination. Now, coordination as an adjective defines like someone is highly coordinated if they are efficient in their movement. So I would say, for example, that as beginners are learning to play soccer, right, they become more and more coordinated as they practice. So that would be an example of using the term coordination as an adjective. But in relation to motor control studies or motor control theories, the term coordination is defined as the patterning of the body and limb motions relative to the patterning of the external objects and events. So simply all that means is that when we discuss coordination, we are talking about how we're able to coordinate our motor skill or our body to the environment. So if I'm picking up a cup, I can pick up a cup if it is on this table, if it's on a shelf, if it's off the ground. I'm able to perform that skill under varying environmental conditions. And so one of the questions that the theories have to answer is that how is that able, or how is that ability possible? So there's 2 points to consider with consideration, and I just mentioned them, that it's the relations of the joints and body segments at a specific point in time in relation to the environment, so that way that skill can be accomplished under that specific situation. Does that make sense, everyone? Don't be frozen. Yeah? Okay, good. So let's talk about sort of control systems. So when they discussed, okay, so let's talk about, and remember, this was done really early. This is before like real high-powered computers, right? So this is coming from behavioral or psychology initially type studies. So they want to sort of understand it from a different perspective than we would as thinking like computers. And so there was discussed that there's two basic ways that there is that the body or the brain could coordinate movement or could sort of create a mechanism to move our bodies. And so they just said that the control systems, that motor control theories would have to incorporate two basic systems of control that we see. Now, let me ask you this question. What is one thing that we notice when we're doing a skill and then all of a sudden we want to do it more accurately? We slow down. And so that was the main point that they so think of behavior, right? Behavior studies. That is the one thing that they noticed in all the different studies, is that when they ask someone to be more accurate, they involuntarily, then consciously do it, they just tend to slow down. So what does that mean? What would slowing down do for the person, or even think about control? Why would slowing down be more effective for us if the goal was greater accuracy? Maybe concentration. Their idea is that with slowing down, you have greater use of feedback, so you can make minor corrections. Meaning that that system is constantly using feedback to make minor and minor corrections. And so that was their idea as to why this whole speed accuracy trade-off seems to be consistent in motor skills. And so what they did was they defined what was called open and closed loop systems. And the open and closed loop systems are describing our control center, or our central executive, our brain. It's describing the sort of instructions that are going to be sent out to the muscles to perform a particular motor skill. Now, we're going to go through each individually, but they would say that the nature of or the content of the instructions that are sent from the brain differs between both an open and closed loop system. In a closed loop system, they say that control of the body from the brain is dependent on the use of feedback. meaning it's a closed loop. So our body would send, or our brain would send instructions and then get feedback and then modify those instructions, and it would be like a closed loop. Now, that would be an example of doing something with high accuracy. And the feedback that you would get while doing the motor skill would be from any of our sensory processes. So that would include things like our sensory receptors, like touch, vision, auditory, like Alec was talking about with the lab, equilibrium, so like balance. You get all of that feedback, and then you can modify the instructions that are being sent out from the brain. So if we are going to be doing a motor skill that's dependent on the use of feedback because we're doing it accurately, the content of our initial instructions are going to be get the system going, and then it's going to be sort of in real time updated over and over and over again. So the content of the instructions from our brain would be to get the system started, and then it would modify, the control of the muscles in real time based on feedback. And the feedback would be used to detect errors and update the control center of the brain during movement. So that's a closed loop system. Now, what happens when we do things that are very, very fast, when there's no opportunity for feedback? That would be described as a open loop system, where we have control is independent of feedback. So although feedback is produced and potentially available from all of our sensory receptors, it's not needed. Let's say you've learned something very, very well. You can perform it faster. You don't need sort of like the accuracy, you don't need the feedback to correct your motor program or the content of the instructions from the brain. You're just so good at it. You've learned it so well that you sort of just need the initial instructions to get it done accurately. Or what if, think about really fast movements, so think of the speed accuracy trade-off. What happens if we have to do something very, very fast? There may not be an opportunity for feedback. So then in that case, our system or our brain is acting in an open loop where there's no chance or there's no time for feedback to update the instructions that are being sent from the brain. So if our brain is acting in an open loop system, it means that all of the instructions to complete the motor skill has to be sent out from the brain. Now, remember, a motor skill is any voluntary movement of our joints and muscles to interact with an environment for the purpose of a goal. So this is any type of motor skill. So our brain can either act in a closed loop where we can get moving and then update and perform more accurately, or it can work in an open loop system where all of the instructions, whatever they may be, are sent out at once, independent of feedback. Oops. There you go. So this is so now do you guys kind of see why it would be called open loop versus closed loop? So this top one, what would that be, open or closed? And so the reason, yeah, the Apollo's right. So the reason why it's called open is because there's not feedback telling the brain to update the instructions, right? Because remember, before this, it was just behavioral studies. So they were like, well, how does the brain control it? They have to come up with these theories to get an idea. For us, I feel as though because we're so used to technology, I think that we just naturally sort of think that way. And interestingly, the way that we have sort of developed an understanding of how the body works is through robotics. So you look at how robotics more efficiently do things, and then it sort of tells us how, it gives us an idea of how the body would actually function. It's we'll get into more in a different lecture, but it's interesting just to note that point. And so it's on the slide, you can see at the bottom, this would be an example of a closed loop system. So in this system, when we're let's say we're doing something that needs or requires feedback, something that is highly accurate, see how we have our brain sending movement instructions. So movement effectors would be the muscles or the body. And then that feedback from our sensory processes are going to be sent back up to the brain and then modify the instructions. So it's a closed loop system. So then the question that I have for you guys, and the big one is speed, but so if the brain our brain can either work in an open or closed loop system, right? You can do things fast or slow. How would the CNS determine whether to act in either a closed loop or an open loop system? Like, how is the central nervous system going to decide if the instructions need to be just enough to get the system going and use feedback, or if it has to, like, the information or the instructions have to contain all of the information to move all of the body points, all the degrees of freedom in a specific way, and accommodate for, the environmental conditions in that specific scenario. What are some reasons why your brain would choose open versus closed loop and vice versa? Then we discussed the main one, which was what? Yes, practice. Yep, you're totally right, Jordan. Speed was the one that we brought up. Accuracy. So then I just put all those sort of right down here, right? So there's many reasons why we may sort of like choose one or the other, right? Think about precision. So if we need high accuracy, we would need to slow down because we need feedback. So a closed loop system, feedback would be necessary when we need to be like highly precise or accurate. Whereas if accuracy isn't the main sort of like factor, then we could work in an open loop system. Now, Jordan had said practice. That's true too. So what about if something's super well learned? Maybe we don't need feedback as much because we're so familiarized with it. And as you get better and better at something, you don't need that feedback, so you can do it quicker. That's something that we do notice, right? Because remember, this is coming from behavioral studies. So they're going to look at people that are good at something, people that are not, and then look at the difference of how they do them, and then make like sort of like, oh, this is what we noticed. Now, this is all the stuff we noticed. Make a law. Like, why would that be? This is sort of how like the research was. Like, it's not quantitative. This is how they sort of like developed these theories initially. What about the one thing that we haven't talked about yet? What about skill type? So remember, like, does anyone remember what a continuous skill is versus a discrete skill? So a discrete skill has a discrete beginning and end, and then a continuous skill, like riding a bike, has no, like, technically no beginning and end because it's like sort of like a continuous motion. So maybe with continuous stuff, because there's more time, there's more repetitions, there's more time for feedback. With as discrete skills that have a discrete beginning and end, like flicking on the light switch, maybe there's no time for feedback. But so here's are some of the reasons to consider why the brain would want to sort of send its instructions in a open or closed loop system. And it turns out that a lot of the time that it sort of relates back into speed or accuracy. Is everyone okay with that? Okay, cool. So these aren't the theories. This is the observations that they made, right? They did a whole bunch of studies and they looked at this factor that, you know what? It looks as though people slow down when they're doing things accurately. Your brain must work in either an open or closed loop system. Now let's put all this information together, get all the scientists together, and let's come up with a theory as to how is the brain doing this? So they developed two specific theories. The first theory is the first one. The first theory is the first one. The first theory was done early, I think like in the 70s. So it's called the motor program-based theory. And its idea is that we have a memory-based mechanism that controls coordinated movement. So it suggests that for every class of movement, we have like a program, a motor program that we sort of download into our brain that's stored, that sort of determines the basic essentials of how we perform that movement. That's a motor program-based theory. Sort of makes sense. And then the next one that was developed much later was called the dynamical systems-based theory, dynamical systems. And it sort of evolved from, I know, what was the class with Megan Lloyd, modal learning? You guys ever heard of self-organization? I think there's a unit, yeah. So that's that theory. It came from that. So the dynamical systems theory emphasizes the role of information in the environment and the mechanical properties of the body and limbs. Oh, you're in it. Okay, so Marco's in it. So you're going to learn about this. This is more, the dynamical systems-based theory is that you have a central executive that sort of controls out to the limbs, and the limbs have a lot of like self-governing based on like sort of the natural patterning of the body. That sounds super confusing, so wait till we get to the like the lecture slides, and I'll sort of reiterate what that means. But the point of this is that there's two main theories. So let's first talk about this whole concept of a motor program. So it was 1980s. So it was developed by this guy named Schmidt. So like the main sort of like initial motor program, motor control textbook. He developed what was called the motor program based theory, or the schema theory. And it was based on this idea of a generalized motor program, like a computer program, which is it's like the common invariant features for a particular type of skill, right? So picking up a cup, that is a program that's downloaded in your brain. And that what people would do is that as we grow up and as we learn more and more motor skills, you're developing a program and refining it based on practice. You're developing a program, and that program is stored in your brain. Does that make sense? So then, therefore, when we talked about, okay, so if we are going to control our body, the nature of the instructions that are sent out from the brain out to the effectors or the muscles and joints is going to be that program. It's going to be the program is going to dictate the way we activate the muscles based on the environment in that situation. So some specifics or characteristics of this generalized motor program is that, well, for one thing, it's kind of difficult to like think about all the different things we do: brush your teeth, pick up a cup, get changed, walking, running, like think of like all of the weird, like typing, like all the different motor skills that we complete in any given day. How are we going to describe what is one class of movements and what's not? So that was kind of like, okay, well, what defines, what we would sort of download as a program? And so what he suggested is that each program that we have for each like class of motor skill has similar characteristics or invariant features that do not vary across like performances of a skill. So he would say, like, for example, like gripping a cup would be one program, gripping a toothbrush, another program, gripping a pair of scissors, another program. And so the identifying signature of one class of movements or one motor program is these invariant features that would be consistent between actions of that similar type. Now, the other thing that remember motor program, sort of motor theories had to discuss is we have to be able to perform that skill. So we have like, so the degrees of freedom problem is answered because we have a program in our brain that sort of dictates how we activate the muscles. Coordination is going to be how we take that program and alter it for the environment, you know, the size of the cup, the distance of the cup, whether or not things are unbalanced, like the features of the environment of that specific situation. So what they called that was parameters. So the parameters of the situation are like things in the environment, sort of factors that are added to the program that sort of complete the program for that situation, and then it's sent out. And then, so remember, it was called the schema theory. His idea was that the schema is like the group of parameters for that given situation. So it's a pretty good theory. Like it was done in the 80s, and it sort of makes sense, right? So we have like we know that so now we know the cerebellum is like stored motor patterns, right? So he suggests that initially he suggested this. We have a program for all the different class of motor skills, and then what we do is we take the parameters of that situation, input it, and then in our motor planning areas, we have the environment added onto the motor program, and then that information is sent out to the muscles, and then we complete the motor skill. Pretty good theory. And so let's discuss this idea of like invariant features. So like, can anyone think of an example of an invariant feature? The one that I find is easy to sort of discuss is sort of take an analogy from music and dance. So if we have a specific type of dance, think about like the waltz. Now, I'm not a ballroom dancer, but the waltz is associated with a particular rhythm where it's like three beats. I don't know. Is anyone dancers? Anyone, any dancers in the class? Anyone do the waltz? You're okay, Violetta. Perfect. Well, there you go. So, and maybe you can answer this, but the rhythm is like the specific to the waltz is three beats. Now, the tempo, like the speed of the music, is the speed at which you waltz. However, the invariant feature of the three beats per measure is consistent. So regardless of how fast or slow you waltz, the rhythm remains the same. So in this case, the waltzing is one motor skill because it shares the similar invariant features. Does that make sense? So hopefully, yeah, Violetta gets it. Anyone else? So like, let's think about it like a dance routine. So like I don't know, like think of y'all TikToks. Like what's a good one right now? I don't know. That's like a good one. There's a couple good ones on right now. What's the? Yeah, never mind. I don't want to. Listen. So yeah, think of your bust it. Uh, yeah. Yo, so okay, so think about our TikTok dances. Each one has specific invariant features. Now, every time you go through, everyone who's doing the challenge, it's a little bit different. Some of them going faster, some of them going slower, but they have the same specific invariant characteristics, right? So therefore, each TikTok dance is one motor skill, whereas the parameters or the invariant features are the same. However, the speed or like some of the different like factors can be changed. So here we have an example of a TikTok dance. Okay. So this is at normal speed. It's a let's say each color is a type of like, I don't know, twerking, and then like, I don't know, someone help me here. Hitting the wall, and then like I don't know what that one be. Make up a dance. Someone give me a dance move. Nay nay, fine. Okay, and this the last one. Okay, so you want to go whip and then nay nay. So we got, okay, easy. Okay, okay. Well, okay, let's do this. Let's do this. Okay, so we're gonna go twerk. What do we go through? What do we say? So twerk. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, this is getting recorded, right? Okay, so twerk, you bust it down, then you whip, and then you end up with a nay. Okay? So each color represents a different dance move. Now you could speed up the dance, and each move is done for a less amount of time, but it's still the same moves. Whereas if we do the dance slower, same idea. Each dance move is just done for a longer amount of time, but the same invariant features are consistent. So therefore, the invariant features that dictate what dance you're doing are the dance moves. So that's an example of like a motor program based theory that each class of motor skill has specific invariant features. uh, okay, at the end of the class, I'll do it. Okay. Yo, I'm sick with it. You guys don't even know. I teach motor control. So let's talk about like an actual like example from a study that they did. So this was one study that was done in the 80s. And so they wanted to, remember how we like in biomechanics, everyone's talking about the gait cycle? This was before that. And so what they wanted to do was look at, if people walk at different speeds, does that mean that there are different classes of walking, or is just walking one speed? Is running a different motor program? Like let's evaluate this. So what they did was they did a study where they looked at people walking. And so they looked at people walking and then increased the speed and just sort of like visualize what was going down. And so what they did was they had people walking at 9 different speeds, and then they calculated the relative time that the person was in each like sort of aspect of the gait cycle. And so what they found was that with different speeds of walking, the percentage time that they spent and each like section of the gait cycle was the same. Whereas when they started running, now all of a sudden the gait cycle sort of percentages changed. So what would this finding be for those people? What would they say? Because if all the invariance features for walking are all the same and they're different for running, they would say that walking is one motor program, running is another motor program, because walking has similar invariant features, no matter like the speed of walking. But once they start running, the sort of percentage time in each of the different like types of gait changed. So like the cycle. So that way the different speeds of running are all one motor program. Different speeds of walking, another motor program. Does everyone get that? Okay. So here's another example. So they had people that they would get them to write. So they got, so this was one classic example. They had people write with their left hand, their right hand, like in a mirror, reversed, and then also with their teeth. And what do you notice about sort of like not the calligraphy, but their like sort of writing style, no matter in which hand they wrote with? Think about this. So if you were going to go write on a piece of paper, with your right hand or your left hand, your cursive writing style is the same. So the way that we write is the motor program. It doesn't matter what the parameter would be, what body part you're using to write your name, right? Or whatever word you're looking for. We have that like sort of like signature or that sort of invariant feature of writing style is downloaded in our brain. So this is an example that, okay, it's suggesting that the parameter, so that we have a motor program for, writing, and then the parameter is the muscle and joints that we're going to use to complete that. So it was a good finding, right? This is all done really way back before computers. So that's another example that sort of proves this whole idea of motor equivalence or motor program-based theory. Any questions about that, guys? You guys okay? Okay. Awesome. Okay. So the second one, the second theory is called dynamical systems-based theory. And so the idea with this is that the critique of the motor program-based theory is that it's still a lot of control. So if your brain has to like sort of download and remember like the activations of each of the different muscles individually for each of the degrees of freedom, all of the different joints, like all of that information, that's a lot of information. So what's another theory that could make more sense, knowing that like if you look at all like whoever took neuroscience, we have so many interneurons, so many reflexes in the spinal cord, so many peripheral receptors. What is one theory that could help describe what we see like sort of in physiology and would mean that we can reduce the amount of instructions that the brain actually has to remember? And so that came from was this whole idea of movement patterns that emerge or self-organize. So what it suggests is that think of human motor control as a complex system, but it behaves like any biological system, that once you get the system going, sort of like the patterning of movement just sort of happens. So you get the system going, like think about you get the system going when you are running, and then sort of like the idea would be that you just get the system going and then the walking pattern just sort of self-emerges based on how The afferent information would change all of the muscles, right? So you have all the reflexes, it all comes together. So what it just means is that the amount of instructions from the brain has to be less because sort of movement patterns sort of emerge as a result of the normal patterning of the biological system. So hopefully that doesn't make, like, think about this. Here's a video. Do you guys get that? One interesting thing is that, do you guys know like drones? You like drones, right? Drones, everyone, we know what drones are. Everyone, drones. A lot of like this idea of like how our bodies actually control movement came from this whole idea of like modeling. And so what they would do is think of a drone. So initially motor program based theory, we have one brain in the drone and then it controls the four propellers and everything is done from, the main brain of the drone. Now that's not actually how it works. The best way for it to work is that each of the individual propellers each has its own like sort of like control center that adjusts independently, and then the central executive is just coordinating between the different areas. Now, if you look at human body, that's actually how we sort of work, right? So much of the information is processed automatically through like reflexes in our joints and in our spinal cord, that the brain, the amount of instructions that has to control is less. It just gets the system going and the rest sort of figures it out itself. Does that make sense? That's sort of the idea of dynamical systems theory, multiple systems working together. Now, I'll play this video. I don't like because the internet was something happened at the beginning of the lecture, so I don't want to like. You guys hear that? I don't want to watch all of it, but this is a video just to sort of describe
some good laws which explain all that.
Dynamic systems-based theory. Oh, shit. Do you guys want to watch the video or just keep going? I think we should just skip the video. Keep going. Yeah, we're all good. Show of hands. Yeah, it seems laggy. Yeah. Okay. So when you guys watched I think I did an okay job of did I do an okay job of trying to explain dynamical systems-based theory? If you're confused, watch the video, okay? And it should sort of help. So one good thing about the dynamical systems-based theory is it brought up a whole lot of different like terminology that is used a lot in motor control research now. So it developed different components, like for example, attractor, order parameters, control parameters, coordinative synergies, perception, action coupling, and affordances. This was terminology that came from dynamical systems-based studies. And this is important because these are terms that we use nowadays to sort of talk about what we visualize when we're doing motor control studies. So this whole idea of dynamical systems-based theory was instead of a motor program, it would say that for every sort of class of movements, we have an attractor state. Right? So an attractor state is a stable patterning of motion. And so what it would say is that for example, like walking, there's this particular sort of, movement pattern that once we get the system going, there's movement patterns that sort of like emerge. And that is defined, that attractor or stable state is defined by order parameters. Instead of saying invariant features, they called it order parameters. Parameters to describe a stable state of motion or an attractor state. And then they said that the things that we sort of modify for a given situation is the control parameters. So if we're talking about walking, we can walk at different speeds. A speed would be a control parameter. The sort of gait cycle that we walk with is an order parameter. So here's an example of an attractor state. So what I guys want you guys to do on your laptop, so I'll do it this way, okay? So you're gonna put your foot, see, like this. Can you guys see that? Like this, right? On your laptops. So what I want you to do is you're going to flex individually each finger at once, and then slowly start to speed it up, and then try to go as fast as you can. And eventually you get to a point where it both happens at the same time. I sounds super weird. Try it. You're gonna go one at a time, and then eventually you get so fast that you just start going in sync. Here's try. You guys do it. So if you had a motor program based theory, they would say that you keep going and then all of a sudden the motor program changes because now you're not going alternate, like you're not going out of phase, you're going in phase. When it's not actually true. You're telling your body the same thing, but the movement pattern just sort of emerges. Can we all agree on that? You guys trying it? You guys definitely trying it. Weird, right? Weird. You didn't change the instructions that are coming out to the hands. It just changed. You kept speeding up, and all of a sudden the movement pattern just changed. So that's like sort of like a really lame, but sort of proof of this whole idea of dynamical systems theory. So what they did is they reevaluated this whole transition, like from going from walking to running. And so what they suggest is that walking and running is not two different motor programs. It's one sort of set of instructions. However, at different speeds, a new pattern of movement or a tractor state appears, just like this, right? You're sending the information to walk, and the faster you go, eventually you're just going to get to a situation where the pattern of running is more efficient or just sort of occurs. And they did the same thing when looking at swim stroke transitions. So the faster you swam, they saw the same thing with walking, that eventually people would just switch to a different patterning of the way they move their arms. So what this is beneficial for is because now we don't have, it decreases the amount of motor programs that we have in our brain, that you have sort of less now because movement patterns are self-organized. So a good idea, or the good point with dynamical systems-based theory is it sort of highlights the central theme of the neurological system, which is like heavy organization or heavy efficiency. So let's just review again. So they're saying that for every sort of class of movement, there is we have attractor states, right? So stable states of movement that are defined by order parameters. And the control parameters are the variable that when we increase or decrease them will influence the stability of the system and potentially move it to another attractor state. Now, what is one thing? Has anyone ever had a cast before? So does anyone have like a walking boot? Okay, so let's say you sprain your ankle and you put a walking boot on. Do you have to A, figure out how to walk again, or B, does it just kind of just like you kind of just figure it out? Oh, Ronnie has one right now. Hopefully it's not too bad. If you need treatment, come into the clinic. Yeah, so your brain just sort of like just figures it out, right? So this whole idea is that with this whole idea of like movement patterns self sort of emerge is this idea of coordinative structures or muscle synergies that the body gets the system going, and then whatever muscle and joints are sort of available, they sort of work with each other as functional units. So whatever is available, your body will use. And that makes sense because so much of our muscle activations is through like reflexes, sort of modifying agonist and antagonist muscles. It's not us consciously changing it, it sort of just happens. So we decide to start walking. I have a walking boot on, and then sort of a rhythm of motion just sort of appears. That's what we see, right? So that idea is coordinative structures or muscle synergies, that our muscles work sort of as a functional unit for every class of movement, and they will sort of adjust or compensate if there's any changes in the system. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. So the other thing that they talked about with the dynamical systems-based theory was this whole idea of perception-action coupling. And so what they said is that, remember how we can pattern our movements to the individual situation or the things that are happening in the environment? This was the first real study that talked about or sort of looked at, so not study, this is the first, this theory really put emphasis on how we sort of most utilize sensory information and integrate it into our movement patterns. So that's called perception action coupling. We perceive the environment and we link it with our action, if that makes sense. Because, for example, what do we notice about like our sensory processes, like in terms of priority? We put high precedence on vision, right? So whatever we see, we take that information in and it helps us modify our movements for that given situation. Perception action coupling. This was a term that they developed in dynamical systems-based theories. So, for example, if you are walking and someone like kicks out a chair, or if you're walking and all of a sudden, you start to slip, or if something, let's say you're walking and there's an object in the middle of a puddle or like a curb or something, we don't stop and then like look at it and then like change our program and restart walking. It kind of all just happens automatically. We perceive something and that's integrated down into our movement pattern that's already ongoing and sort of adjusted. So that's an example of perception action coupling. And then the last thing is this whole idea of affordances. And so there was this one study that like they were looking at two different things. One was, so what they would do is they would have people that would, they would increase the size of the step. And so people would naturally know when they could step over it or when they had to step on top of it based on the size of their body. The other one was like if you had, so they had like a door frame and they had people walking through the door. And then each repetition, they would get the door frame a little bit smaller. And then there's a point in time where like the person would hit their shoulders. They would know ahead of time that they would see the door, they will walk up towards it, and automatically they would know that they would have to go sideways to get through the door frame. So affordances means that like people generally have an idea of the like sort of like how their body fits in the environment. Does that make sense? So these are just terms that came out of, or things that we observed that came out of dynamical systems-based studies in terms of motor control. Now, so in real life, a hybrid of the theories exists, right? There's things that we download, and there's also an idea that like not everything is just dynamical systems-based theory. The way that our body probably like is sort of coordinated is a sort of a play between the two, and that's currently where we are at with research. So is that confusing everyone, or does that sort of make sense? So we just sort of discussed the idea of motor control and what the two theories would have to describe in terms of control systems. Then we discussed the two different theories. Everyone good? Drew knows. Okay, awesome. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is, okay, so if we are able to pattern our movements to the environment, how are we going to do that? Obviously through sensory processes. So let's review the sensory processes that we utilize to modify our motor skills, okay? So the first one would be sensory information, right? So, or sorry, not the first one. I'm saying we are going to utilize sensory information to adjust our movement patterns. So this is going to give us, so sensory information can be used before we initiate movement to sort of understand what we need to do. It can be utilized with a movement in progress. Think of it like a closed loop system to modify a movement to increase accuracy as it's already in progress, or it could be sensory information can be used after for us to determine like what we did wrong. So sensory information can be used either before, during, or after. And there's three main important types of sensory information that we utilize to sort of adjust our movements. That's touch, vision, and proprioception. So with using touch, it typically comes from our skin receptors. Now you won't be really judged on the different types of receptors, but we use touch in motor control. And we wanted to look at sort of how useful is touch when performing different types of skills. So what they would do is there was a whole class of studies that would look at like how important is touch in our ability to perform different types or different classes of motor skills. So like things like pointing, reaching, grasping, typing. What they wanted to do is they wanted to look at studies where they could have person doing a type of motor skill, anesthetize their fingers so you lose sense of touch, and then see how it changes. Because then that would tell us why touch is important. It allows for whatever, right? The other thing that you could do is take a motor skill that doesn't have touch, add touch to it, and then see if it changes. So there's a whole bunch of different studies, and if you have the textbook, you can go read through them. But they did do a lot of like interesting findings where they found that for people that were like pointing or piano players or people that had to like reach and point at certain things, when they anesthetized the fingers, they would lose accuracy. So specifically with like typing, if you had someone typing, they count the number of errors that you did, you add sort of anesthetic to the fingertips, your accuracy changes. So that makes sense, right? Maybe it gives you feedback that you're like hitting the keys and you're sort of more aware, but that information clearly is ingrained in our ability to do the motor skill because it was altered when we sort of modified the sense of touch. Consistency. So what they did was with the typers and pianists, what they also found was that, so you know how like people that type, you're supposed to be like, at F and J, and you do it very like in a specific way, or pianists, they have their hands in like a same position. They found that when touch was gone, that they tend to alter their hand positions more. So it tend to like decrease the consistency of how they type or perform the sheet of music. Interesting. It changed like timing. So what they had people doing was that they had people drawing a circle in the air. This is all kind of lame stuff. Or they had it where they would draw a circle in the air, but at the top they touched something. And it found that their timing was consistently better when they had the sense of touch. And what we're going to notice throughout all of this is that the more sensory information you add to a particular motor skill, the more it's sort of like memorized, the more that it's ingrained, or the more that you can get out of it. Oh, and then they found that like for things like where you need to grasp, like so touching so this is obvious, makes sense, but when you anesthetize the fingers, you would tend to like not be able to grip very well because you couldn't get the feedback of like how hard you had to grip. So people would like not grip hard enough and then the cup would fall. So that is all examples of how we use touch in motor skills. The second one is proprioception. Now, we've talked about different proprioceptors in intro to movement neuroscience. Sorry for Marco and Violetta, but hopefully you got to that point. But do you guys know what the term proprioception means? It's our awareness of our body positioning in space. So if I close my eyes and I make like the letter Y or a thumbs up, like I know what position my body's in. Can we all agree on that? Now that information comes from proprioceptors. Receptors in the muscles and the joints that allow us to understand how our body is positioned in space. We have GTOs, muscle spindles, and joint receptors. So what they wanted to do in studies is take away proprioception and then look at how sort of it changes someone's ability to perform motor skills. And so there was two main ways that they did this. The first one was animal studies, where they would sort of, this is bad, but they would get them to do certain movements and then cut their dorsal column. So it would remove their proprioception and then look at how it changes their ability to perform like different like movements that they taught them. The other thing to do is, because it's not like ethical to do that in humans, obviously. So what they would do is they would use diabetic patients. Because diabetic patients, they have neuropathies, and the larger fibers go first, and the largest fibers are the proprioceptive fibers. So people with diabetes tend to have very lacking proprioception. specifically in their feet. So you could use them as like take diabetic people with neuropathy versus controls and then have them doing the same skill and look at the difference. So that's another way that they could sort of evaluate how important proprioception is. There was a third mechanism that they did where they would do like vibration. They would use like a think of like a thumper or like those like massage guns. They would use that as vibration on the tendons that tend to like screw up proprioception or feedback. So what they found, so here's an example of a study that sort of used people that were controls and people that had sort of diabetic neuropathies. So they had peripheral neuropathies that they were unable to use proprioception. Structured means where, so it was a reaching and pointing task. So structured means that they had things in the environment that you could sort of gauge. And then the unstructured means that it was just like black and just like dark, and they couldn't really, like, it was just one point. And so what they found was that when you had situations where the person had no proprioception for reaching and pointing, they had a decrease of ability when you took vision away. So when you had vision, the performance decreased just a little bit. But when you remove vision, their performance was terrible. So it means two things: that A, we use proprioception as feedback. It's important in us completing motor skills. But if proprioception isn't available, it means that we use vision, which makes sense. Vision that we know now is primary. It's our priority. So if we don't have proprioception, we tend to use vision. And if then that is gone, then we have no choice but to use the problem proprioception. So here's another example. When you're learning to dance, so who was the dancer? Was it Violetta? No. Yeah, it was Violetta. When you're learning to dance, what do like beginner dancers tend to do? They look at their feet, right? Or when you're learning how to skateboard, or when you're learning how to skate, or when you're learning how to dribble, you tend to look at it. And then as you become better and better, then you're more aware and you can better utilize proprioception. It's a better example. And then in this study, this is an example of a study where they had people drawing a circle, and then they used tendon vibration to see how that would affect their ability to draw a circle, and they were just less accurate. So overall, what they found was that proprioception was important for movement accuracy, right, with the reaching and pointing. It was important with the timing of motor commands. So this study was a little bit different, where they had people, this is so weird, but they had people where they had to like stand up and they had to like raise their foot and their hand at the same time to the beat of the metronome. So their hand and foot had to be up at the same time, like a dance move kind of. And what they found was that people that had the control groups with proprioception, they would lift up their foot because it took longer, a little bit ahead of when they raised their arm. So that way their hand and foot would be up at the same time. Whereas people, the peripheral neuropathy people, they would start moving their hand and their foot at the same time. So what they found was that it was like this, where they would, their timing was a little bit off, where their foot was lagging behind. And the only difference between the two groups was proprioception. So clearly proprioception has also helped to utilize or helped in the timing of motor skills. Cool. You guys okay? Almost done. So the last thing that the last sensory process that they sort of evaluated was the big one, which is vision. And so vision is primary for all of us. Here is like, the sensory receptors in our eye. It crosses over the optic chiasma, and then it is processed in the occipital lobe. So that's our sense of vision, right? We know vision is primary for lots of different reasons. Beginning typists look at their fingers. Beginning dancers look at their feet, like I had mentioned. The main study that sort of proved this is what's called the moving room experiments. Have you ever seen this? Where what they would do is they would have people standing on this. See how like this is a room, right? The room is on tracks. So the room, so that you get the person turned around. And so the room goes back and forth. So the floor, like your feet would register that the floor isn't moving, but you would see the wall coming at you. For example, another example would be like, you guys are sitting at a red light and then the car starts, the car beside you is moving a little bit. And then you like freak out and think that you're like, put your foot off the gas. Yeah. The reason why is because, yeah, all the time. The reason why is because we can't, like, we have no choice, but our body uses vision more than anything. So in these like moving room experiments, if they had people standing there and the room was coming at them, they would lose balance. Even though the floor wasn't moving, vision would tell them that they're like falling or moving. Nowadays in motor control studies, what it's really important to understand is like what people are looking at. So what they find is that as people get better and better at performing motor skills, they're better at picking out in the environment what they need to look at. So if you look at people that are beginner drivers versus like people that have been driving for years, beginner drivers are you follow their eyes. So this is an eye movement recording device that tracks where the pupil is looking. Beginners, their eyes are kind of all over the place, looking at everything. Whereas as you become better and better, your eyes tend to just focus on what's most important in the environment. And we know that now because of these sort of like these studies using this device. Temporal occlusion techniques. So before those goggles that would tell you where your eye is looking at, what they used to do was they used to do motor skills and turn off the lights at certain times to see what would be most important. Or like, so for example, like I have an example right here of an example of a study with Cristiano Ronaldo. So what they wanted to do was have people performing motor skills and then turn off the lights or take away vision at certain time points and see how it affected their performance. If you turned it off at a specific time point and it really affected performance, something after you turn off the light seems to be the most important for that motor skill and performing it. So let me play this video. It's super interesting. And then we'll finish off the lecture. Is that okay, guys? And then let me just confirm. Can you guys see that? Hear that?
Gives him the ability to intuitively read the game under normal
Yeah?
conditions.
Okay.
But what
Okay,
if
you
the
watch it. I gotta go
conditions are
just
very
talk
far
to my
from
secretary.
normal? Can Ronaldo still hit the back of the net if all the lights are turned off and he's in complete darkness?
Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to have Athlete feeding the balls in as if it's a cross, and then sometime in the ball flight, the lights are going to go black, so you won't be able to see anything at all. We're expecting you to be able to put the ball in the goal. That's what we're hoping will happen. We're hoping that you'll have picked up some advanced cues from Andy's body position, the shapes, the positioning of his feet and his hips, and therefore we'll be able to tell exactly where the ball's going to go and get yourself in the right position, even though you can't see it.
Taking Ronaldo on in the seemingly impossible test is an amateur footballer called Ronald.
Come and join me, Ronald. Ronaldo. So we've got Ronald in here, same age as you, roughly the same height. We're going to use Ronald as a comparison and see how he reacts doing this same test.
Ronald is going first.
Dark! Light!
So what does the night vision reveal? Ronald misses the ball by quite a way. Perhaps not that surprising. But can Ronaldo do any better?
I hope to do once.
Dark! Light!
Alright, that's one straight in the bag.
The night vision replay shows how differently Ronaldo performs. To confirm that wasn't just luck, another attempt.
Dark! Light!
Love that. Be careful.
And the replay?
How hard is that? It's difficult because it's changed a lot. Yeah. Because you are focusing the ball, and after the light, you have to try to memorize the ball.
Human reaction time is about 200 milliseconds, and by 500 milliseconds, Ronaldo's subconscious has interpreted Andy's body language.
Oh, shit. Oh, okay. But do you guys get the point of the video? Did you? Okay, that's good. So the idea would be that as you have a professional, you are better able to pick out in the environment what's most important to complete the skill. So if you compare Ronaldo, Cristiano Ronaldo versus, what was the guy's name? Ronaldo was better able to get information from the environment to complete the task versus Ronald. And that's something that we see through different sort of like vision studies that evaluate what people are looking at through either those like eye movement tracking devices or through different sort of like lighting techniques like temporal occlusion, or what they used to do back in the day was event occlusion technique. So here's an example of a study where they would have like a expert badminton player have to guess which way the birdie was going to be served. And so what they would do is they would make them watch a whole like video, like a full-length video of like someone doing it, and make them guess. Then they would have them do the same video with like blacking out an aspect of the video. So here the arm's missing, here the racket's missing, here the guy's head's missing, here the lower body is missing, and I'm not sure what's missing in this one. Something in the environment. And so what they would do is see how well the person was at guessing at which way it's going to go based on what was missing. And then that tells you that that was important for those people in performing the motor skill. Does that make sense, everyone? Awesome. So I know I cut it off a little bit early, but watch that Ronaldo video. It's super interesting because he's so good that he's able to perform the task when they shut out the lights even before he sees the ball coming. Science studies have looked at like sort of like different aspects of vision that are important. One study looked at sort of the difference between like, so we have two eyes. What is sort of beneficial of having one eye versus two eyes? So we have binocular vision. It allows us for depth perception. And so what they did was they did an analysis of doing different motor skills with like taking only like monocular vision and seeing what is sort of adjusted or affected, and you would lose your depth perception. Oh, okay. Okay. So when we look at like studies of vision, there's actually two like sort of streams of vision, or two levels of vision. We have our central vision, which is the narrow band of what we're focusing in on. So when we looked at eye movement recording devices and we were talking about them looking at foveal vision, it's what our eyes are specifically looking at. So that's the central 2 to 5 degrees of visual sort of our visual field, and it's what we're specifically looking at. So it's what we're focusing in on. And when we talk about sort of what that information is provided, or what provides us specifically, our central vision is what we use to focus on different like objects or sizes or distances in different motor skills. It also is what we're focusing in on our path. So in like sort of like reaching and grasping tasks, our central vision is focusing in on objects in the environment that are important to us. When we're walking or for like locomotion type sort of motor skills, our central vision is sort of narrowed on our like sort of path that we're focusing in on. Our peripheral vision then is that's the outside, like upper like limit of 200 degrees outside of what we're focusing in on. Like, so I can be focusing in on like the camera, but I'm still aware of things in the peripheral vision. Our peripheral vision is for monitoring movement. So it's like optic flow. So when we are doing a reaching and grasping task, so let's say I'm reaching for this cup, my central vision is focusing in on the cup, but then my peripheral vision is looking at like sort of things that are moving in the environment. So it's giving me feedback from the movement of my arm, telling me if like there's things in the environment that telling me that the cup potentially could move. Peripheral vision is giving us giving us motion, whereas central vision is giving us specifics of the object. for example, and then for walking and like locomotion type motor skills, our central vision is focusing in on the path, but it's our peripheral vision that is sort of telling us of anything moving in the environment. So the idea is that we have two different streams of vision, and they're necessary for perception to action coupling. One thing that I wanted to say was that, like, so what is the fastest that we could have time to react where we can move in a closed loop system? So typically the idea or the estimation is between 100 and 160 milliseconds is the lowest amount of time that we could have where we could still like, sort of operate with feedback. And then the last thing is that there was one research study that talked about like how do we time our movement. So if I'm like catching a baseball, like trying to hit a baseball or catching a moving object, or like if I'm walking and I have to step over a curb, how do I time that information? And so what they looked at was sort of how like it must happen automatically, right? Like it's not like we're consciously thinking about, okay, now catch it, now catch it. You kind of time your motions with it. And so how it works is it's the relative size of the image in our eye. So when an object is coming closer to us, right? So like think of it like a ball coming at you, right? It exponentially starts to get bigger as you come closer, right? So we use that information to time our movements. And that whole sort of principle is called time to contact, or tau. So we time our motions based on how fast it's coming at us, right? So if I'm walking, I time my movement of stepping over a curb based on how fast I'm walking, and that's automatically imprinted into or processed into my brain to help me time when I'm going to initiate the stepping over. What about when I'm catching like a ball, for example? And they know this because, so like when the ball's coming, I'll look at the ball the last minute because it'll tell me sort of like the timing to reach out and grab it. So the last little bit about this lecture is just that we time our movements based on this like whole time to contact concepts that we sort of developed using our eyes, obviously. So review the lecture. I guess the last part was that we went through a little bit faster. But do you guys have any questions before I get going? Okay, awesome. Watch the Ronaldo video, read through the last little bit of the slides, just talking about like sort of like central vision versus peripheral vision and time to contact. It's important just to know that that's how we sort of like time our movements, right? So when we have central vision, it's what we're focusing in on. Peripheral vision is for monitoring movement. And then we time our actions based on time to contact. And we pick them up by looking at the object. And then we use that information to time our movements. Okay? So I apologize for the sort of speed at the end there, but I will sort of review it after next lecture, and then I will see you all next week, okay? Didn't have time for the TikTok, but I'll make up for it. Everyone good? Okay. Bye, guys.